told everyone to start Sean Tucker. If only I had taken my own advice, Joe. I left him on the bench in one of my leagues. It cost me the game.
All right, everybody, and welcome back. As always, I am your party host, Joe Rivera, and along with me is one of the preeminent ball knowers of USA Today Sports, fantasy expert. You know him as Jacob Kamenker. We know him as Vaughn Miller. Jacob, there's a famed 2010s movie called John Tucker Must Die, but we're going to flip the clock forward a little bit and call it Sean Tucker Must Start. Your thoughts on Tucker's must start designation last week? What's running through your mind when you see the Bucks running back go off?
Yeah, so I was happy to see that happen because I told everyone to start Sean Tucker. If only I had taken my own advice, Joe. I left him on the bench in one of my leagues. It cost me the game, but it was just one of those great matchups. You look at the Bills, they have allowed a lot of rushing touchdowns to running backs, and Tucker was just primed to take over for Rashad White. So it's a perfect storm of events there. Is he going to be a start this week, though? We're going to have to check on Bucky Irving, Joe. We'll get more into that later, but there's a lot of question marks about whether you're going to want Tucker in your lineup.
When do we not talk about Bucky Irving, right? Like, it feels like Bucky is just the staple for the show every week at this point. But all right, Jacob, let's get it hot and ready like a Caesar's pizza. Let's start with your sleepers this week, right? Like, again, we're getting into the point of the fantasy season where it's no risk it, no biscuit, right? Fantasy managers, if they want to make that playoff push and really jump themselves into contention, they're going to have to make some tough decisions and maybe go for it. And the first one on your list here, I'm intrigued by this. I like this a lot. I'm going to give you the runway here. Who's your first sleeper on your list for your fantasy sleepers this week?
Yeah, so it's a tough week for streaming quarterbacks. There aren't a whole lot of guys out there outside of maybe Jacoby Brissett that you can trust. I'm willing to roll with Tyler Shuck from the Saints against the Atlanta Falcons. Now, Joe, it might sound crazy, but the Falcons were just shredded by Bryce Young for 448 yards and 3 touchdowns. They've allowed 10 passing touchdowns over their last 4 games. And we saw before the Saints bye, Tyler Shuck looked good against the Carolina defense that I would say has been more consistent than the Falcons defense. So I think that if he can have a similar performance to his 282-yard, 2-touchdown game against Carolina, he's going to end up challenging for one of those top 10 quarterback spots this week. So I think he might be a sneaky good play here against middling Falcons pass defense. Now, obviously, there's a lot of risk. This is a guy who's a rookie making, I believe, his 3rd NFL start here. But hey, like you said, no risk it, no biscuit. And because of the situation at quarterback this week, you might have to hold your nose and make a just bold play like this to see if it can keep your lineup afloat, especially if you're looking for a replacement for someone like Bo Nix or Justin Herbert.
Saints angling for a top 5 pick. You figure that they have to see something from Shuck moving forward, which might be a good thing for fantasy managers looking to get some volume out of the passer position. All right, Jay, let's head out west to a team that's not quite as bad as the Saints, but the Los Angeles Rams. These guys are looking like Super Bowl contenders this year. And it starts a little bit with the running game where you have this running back as a sleeper. Tell fantasy managers why they should trust Blake Corum as a sleeper this week.
Yeah, I think anytime you're looking at help at the running back position, you're looking for some amount of volume. And Corum, despite working behind Kyron Williams, has gotten that in recent games. Over his last 4 outings, he's averaging 12 touches per game. So, I mean, it's not like you're not going to look at him and say, hey, he's going to overtake Kyron Williams this week, but he's averaging a respectable 40.5 yards per game during that 4-game stretch. So if you look at that volume and say, hey, maybe Corum will get a touchdown, that's going to be enough to make him a rock-solid flex play. The other part of this is that the Buccaneers have allowed the 7th most fantasy points per game to running backs this season. Granted, a lot of that damage has been through the air, and Corum isn't a big-time pass catcher. But all it takes, as we saw last week with Ty Johnson against the Buccaneers, is one long catch to kind of make a fantasy outing worthwhile for one of these backup running backs. So I think Corum's worth trusting given the volume and the potential for an explosive player at touchdown in what could be a high-scoring matchup.
All right, Jake, I'm going to ask you this question about the Rams because Puka Nacua, we know he's dealt with injuries throughout his career, hasn't missed a ton of time, but again, injury this year. Matthew Stafford, a guy that we knew going into the season had back problems, and they haven't manifested themselves yet. Devontae Adams maybe getting up there, still in the new offense, and we're figuring it out. But what's your trust level in the Rams offense right now from a fantasy perspective?
Yeah, I think they're one of the most consistent units in fantasy, and it all goes back to Sean McVay. Sean McVay is one of the best offensive minds in the game. So that's going to allow the Rams to play very consistently. And I know that there are those injury concerns with Stafford and Nakua. And, Devontae Adams has even been banged up a little bit in recent weeks, and Kyron Williams has missed time over his career. But as long as all those guys stay healthy, they will remain consistent. And even if one is out of the lineup, Sean McVay has the offensive prowess needed to kind of scheme around that and still find a way to get all of his guys open. You have all those talented tight ends there too. So I think so long as Matthew Stafford stays on the field, all of the guys on the field for the Rams are going to be able to produce at a level that fantasy managers are going to be very happy with.
From something of a sure thing with the Rams offense to something of an unsure thing with the Falcons offense. We know about Bijan Robinson and the inconsistency in his usage there throughout the 2025 season, but Darnell Mooney is a sleeper pick of yours this week. Interesting choice, Jacob. Tell fantasy managers why they can trust Mooney as a sleeper selection.
Okay, so this is a little bit of a tough sell, but because Mooney has just 16 catches this year, but the quarterback change could help him. He hasn't shown as good chemistry with Michael Penix Jr., but last season with Kirk Cousins, he averaged 4.1 catches and 62.4 yards per game in his 14 starts. So between that and the fact that, as you mentioned, Drake London is dealing with a knee injury, he's not expected to play this week. I'm anticipating that Darnell Mooney is going to get a high volume of targets in this offense. So that could allow him to have a good game against the Saints defense that we know can be leaky at times. Now, I know a lot of fantasy managers are going to say, well, this exact situation happened against the Dolphins a few weeks ago, and Mooney had just, I believe, one catch for 11 yards. That's true, but I'm thinking that Kirk Cousins might be able to bounce back now that he's had a little bit more playing time. But there is obviously some risk to this, but Mooney's deep speed, I think, makes it enough of a chance that I'm willing to take because I think the volume is going to be there.
If you had to, we'll say Nerf gun to your head here, Jacob. Kirk Cousins, what's his outlook this week? I'm curious what you think because this is a guy that's, veteran passer. Last time we saw him in extended play, didn't seem like he had the arm still. Maybe the Achilles was still bothering him a bit. They'd make the change to Penix, but now back in the starting position, potentially for the remainder of the season. What's your best guesstimate on what Kirk Cousins will give fantasy managers potentially the rest of the season?
Yeah, to be honest, I wouldn't trust Kirk Cousins at this point just because in the limited action that we've seen him this season, he hasn't looked good. He hasn't even thrown a touchdown yet, and it just doesn't look like he looks like a shell of himself. He doesn't look like the same player that he once was. And that's somewhat to be expected. He's in his late 30s and he's dealt with pretty significant injuries that, torn Achilles. And then he had a little bit of a shoulder problem last year that he kind of outlined in that Netflix quarterback series over the summer. So I just don't know where he's at health wise, if he's been able to bounce back from those. So I wouldn't expect a lot from him. Obviously, he's a savvy veteran. He's going to be able to distribute the ball to his receivers. But I'm expecting the Falcons are probably going to lean on the running game to help carry them. And then a heavy dose of Darnell Mooney and Kyle Pitts just to move the ball down the field. But I don't know that Cousins has the type of upside that you're looking for in a fantasy starter, at least not yet. If he can string together a couple of decent starts, then maybe you start thinking about him as a guy that if you have some injuries in the playoffs, you can at least add him to your roster in matchup-based scenarios.
All right, Jacob. And last but not least on your sleeper picks this week, Dan Campbell made headlines a couple weeks ago, taking over offensive play calling. Looked good for a week, and then they played the Eagles defense, and it didn't look as good. So Sam Laporta on IR, looking at the tight end spot here. We know Dan Campbell, a former tight end himself, likes tight ends. Why does Brock Wright make your list this week for sleeper picks?
Yeah, so we talk about volume a lot, and that's what Wright's going to have as the team's number one tight end with Laporta out. And we saw that against the Eagles. I know Jared Goff was terrible, but you have to understand Goff does not play nearly as well outdoors as he does indoors, and it was very windy in Philadelphia. So naturally, Goff struggled. But Wright during that game was targeted 7 times. He only had 2 catches for 8 yards, but there were a couple times when Goff could have gotten him the ball for larger gains. And there was another instance where Wright was breaking open in the end zone, and Goff just didn't have the time to get the ball to him. He just had to throw it to Amon-Ra St. Brown. So, there's enough opportunity and enough chances for Wright to potentially get in the end zone that I'm willing to back him. And the Lions are now playing at home. in that climate controlled environment at Ford Field against the Giants defense that hasn't been very good this year. So I'm willing to back him here and say, hey, there aren't a lot of tight ends that are going to get a ton of volume, but Brock Wright is one of them, and he has the size needed to have that touchdown upside. So I'm willing to plug him into my lineup if I need some help at that position.